So, welcome to the latest instalment of my Writers in Conversation series. Today I'm joined by Stuart Gibbon, and we're going to be talking about writing the detective. Now, I'm actually so excited about this topic, particularly because I write YA thrillers, but also because Stuart's a former police detective. So yeah, he's got a lot of inside knowledge on how investigations are run by the police, and obviously this is just really useful information for any crime writer. Stuart is also one of the writers of the Crime Writers Casebook, which is an excellent, really informative guide designed to help writers with their portrayals of investigations. Now, this book is actually amazing. Stuart sent me a signed copy of this book ahead of this chat, so yeah, I've got my copy here. There we go. I always forget where the webcam bit is, and I'm trying to line it up. But yeah, this book, it just covers such a wide range of things. So you've got forensics, you've got police procedure, case studies. It's just a wealth of information, and I found it so invaluable already in my research. Now, Stuart also runs a consultancy business helping writers with police details for their books. And as soon as I found this out, I was just so interested in learning more, particularly as research is just such an important part of writing thrillers. And obviously, we want these books to be as accurate as possible. And yeah, it's always really helpful to know someone you can just ask those quick questions to when you're writing or researching. So, firstly, Stuart, do you want to say a bit about your background and your work within the police before we get started on actually talking about writing the detective?
Yeah, thanks. Firstly, thanks for inviting me. It's lovely to see you. My background is all in police. I've really done very little other than being a police officer until I left the force a few years ago. But it all started way back in the 1980s. I was born in Gateshead in the northeast of England, and I went to school up there, spent the time up there, and probably would have been there to this day had it not been for a couple of things that happened. Our family home was broken into when I was a kid, and I remember coming home with my mum and being really upset, and obviously the whole family was, because the place had been ransacked and had been turned upside down, and it was really quite a traumatic incident for all of us. And I remember thinking at that time that, this is just not very nice and not right. And it was basically for the local force, which was Northumbria. And they invited me to be a volunteer police cadet, which meant just really going and meeting some other youngsters, boys and girls, and just doing a bit of learning about the law. And I really found it very enjoyable. So the plan for me was to hopefully, when I got to the right age, to join Northumbria Police. But when I got to that age, I applied to join, but unfortunately they weren't recruiting in the area. And I made lots of inquiries around the northeast and even further down the country. But the other thing I did was also write to London, and I'm not sure why I did that, but I wrote to the Metropolitan Police just on the off chance, and you probably guessed the ending of that. The only letter I got back of a positive nature was from London saying, come down and we'll interview you. And there was quite a strict process, and I managed to get into the police, and I became a PC. I was posted to Wembley. I didn't really know much about Wembley at that point. I didn't know much about London, and it was really probably the first time I'd been away from home, for other than school camp, so I was quite a home person, really. So it was quite a shock and a cultural wake-up call to be launched into London at a pretty young age, still a teenager. I was posted to Wembley, worked there for quite a few years. And from an early stage in my police career, and probably earlier than that, I quite fancied the sound of being a detective. All I really knew about it then was what I'd seen on television, but it sounded like the sort of job that I would like to do. And eventually, after quite a lot of hard work and going through almost like an apprenticeship, I managed to become a detective in London. And again, I carried on working there for a few years. And then as a family, we relocated and we moved up to the Midlands. So it meant that I put in for a transfer. So I moved from the Met, a very big force, policing the capital, to a really quiet, leafy kind of urban area with lots of rural places as well, which was a bit of a culture shock. So I initially moved to the county of Lincolnshire, and I worked in the East Midlands then. I continued working initially in uniform and then back as a detective again. I was promoted a few times. And in the last few years of my career, before I left the police, I was a senior detective. I was a DCI, working in charge of murder cases. So that was, amongst many other parts of my career, probably one of the most challenging, dealing with bereaved families, trying to find people who committed murders. And I did that for quite a few years. And then when it came to the time when I'd served 30 years in the police, I had a decision to make. Do I carry on doing what I'm doing? I think it's probably fair to say that certainly the last few years in dealing with murder cases, that had quite an impact on me in terms of physical health. You work awfully long hours. It's obviously quite a stressful role as well. And I decided it was time to try and maybe do something different. I think part of the decision making was around the fact that that's all I'd ever done was police work. I literally went from school into the police. So I decided, it's time to maybe do something else. But if I can use my skills and knowledge that I've built up over the last few years to do something that helps other people still, then that's what I'll do. So when I left the police, I moved on and set up my own business, and I now do one or two things, including, as you've mentioned, the consultancy work.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, how does your consultancy business work then? Because I'm really intrigued by it. Like, how much involvement do you have in the writing process when authors seek your expertise?
It initially started because I'd read one or two books myself. I mean, I like to read anyway, and I didn't have a great deal of spare time. But the time I had, I would often pick up a book. And I'd read a couple of books and seen some procedures in there that I thought was a bit, I wasn't sure how realistic it was. And I was just really interested to know where they'd got their information from. So I spent a little bit of time flicking through the acknowledgements in these books just to see if whoever had given them. And often I would see there was no real, thanks to Sergeant Smith or thanks to whoever for giving the police insight. So it looked like there might be a bit of an opportunity, should we say, there for me to help authors and maybe put some authenticity to some of their writing. So that was kind of how it started. And I basically contacted the Crime Writers Association because I thought crime was where I sat probably most comfortably at that point, certainly. And then I started to literally just do some research and look up authors that were writing crime and sent them emails and just made contact with them and said, look, this is what I used to do. This is what I'm looking at doing now. If you're interested, can you sort of, let me know? And it went very quiet and I didn't hear anything for a while. And I just kind of figured that there wasn't really a lot of interest. But over a period of time, then it just started built up to the point where I've now got, quite a busy database, if you like, of clients that I work with. In terms of how the consultancy works itself, there are three different ways, I guess, really. I mean, it can work however people want it to work. But if the author is local to me in the East Midlands, we'll sometimes meet up. I've got a couple of authors that I actually have face-to-face meetings with. So before the lockdown, we'd meet up and have a coffee or a tea and have a chat, catch up. And we'd go through a book, and talk about the issues and answer the questions. So face-to-face a couple of times. But then obviously telephone calls, I manage telephone calls. So sometimes it's so much easier to talk to someone on the phone than try and type an email out. I'm not the greatest of typists, and I can explain something fairly quickly, which might be a little bit complex, rather than spending ages for me typing it out. So sometimes the phone calls actually work quite well. But in fairness, the bulk of my work is via email. So I will receive an email from either an author that I'm already working with, who we've built up a rapport and we work together, or it might be a new author. It could be a author that's written many books but just wants a little bit of help and a little bit of pointing in the right direction, or it could be somebody that's just starting out on their writing journey and has no idea about police procedures or just wants to ask the odd question. There's two different ways that I kind of manage it. One is answering questions. That initially was probably the most popular way. So an author will send me a list of questions. The thing that makes me smile a little bit, and I don't say this about every writer because I'm sure they're not all like this, but it does make me giggle a little bit, is I may have a conversation or exchange emails with an author who'll say, I've got 3 questions I'd like to ask. And I say, that's absolutely fine. If you can just send me the 3 questions and I'll get back to you. And then when the 3 questions arrive and you actually read them, each question has kind of 7 or 8 questions within that question. So you know what I mean, don't you? When you say,
I thought you were going to say that.
It's the thought process, and I understand exactly how it happens. Because when you ask one question, it leads on to another one, and then what happens if this happens, and if this doesn't happen, what happens then? So it kind of becomes a bit more. So I sometimes have to kind of explain to people that it might take me a little bit longer because there are more questions. It's not an issue for me at all. So questions are probably, certainly initially, the most popular way that it would work. Send me some questions. I'll have a look at them. I'll then put something together. in a document format, answer all your questions, then I'll send it back to you. Then you have a read through it. Often there's more questions come from my answers, so then it kind of works like that. And there might be some clarification. I might have put something there. I've maybe not explained it brilliantly, and somebody needs me to go through it. Recently, I've started doing a lot more fact checking. So that works in two ways. I mean, literally recently, I've had a book from a reasonably well-known author I'm the first person to have read this particular book because it's just been written. So it was a case of, here's it in its rough format. It's gone off to the editor, but would you please read it for me? And obviously there was an option for me. There was some highlighted parts of it as well that were particularly police procedure. But in the end, I read the whole thing because you need to put it into context. And if there's a little paragraph in the middle, sometimes you've got to go back a few pages. So in the end, I read the whole thing and I enjoyed it. It was really good. I gave the author the feedback, and that worked quite well. And I must admit, there's been a few times where I've read either the whole book, which obviously can take me quite a while because it is quite time consuming, especially if you have to stop and make notes and then carry on again. Or what seems to be quite popular as well now is the author will pull out the relevant sections from the book. It might just be a few pages, and then they'll give me a little paragraph at the top to put it into context. This is what I want answering, this is what the book's about, this is the section I want you to read, and I'll simply just read through that. So that just reduces the time it takes me, and it just makes it quicker and easier to manage. But it seems to work quite well, and it's quite nice actually to read a book subsequently, and you can actually identify the bits that you've helped with sometimes, not always, but sometimes you can actually see where you've given the advice. And of course, I'd say to people, it's just advice. You don't have to put what I'm telling you in the book. All I'm doing is, and again, sometimes some authors, they just want to know how it works. They're not going to maybe use that bit in the book, but if they understand how the things work, then they can write their book accordingly, and they know, then they've got the reassurance that they know that they're not going to put anything in that's kind of inaccurate from a police point of view.
Yeah, like that does actually link to one of the questions that I can see we've been asked live during this video. So we've been asked like how authentic someone can be in their writing. Do you often think that certain aspects of detective work fit better to a narrative form if these certain things have changed first, would you say? Like if an author is coming to you with a question about their plot, can you always sort of like work around what they've already written, or does it often require like substantial rewrites on the author's part in order to make it an authentic portrayal of police procedure?
Yeah, it's a great question actually. It's quite a challenge. I mean, sometimes, as I say, I just get the questions or maybe the fact checking, but I've got a few authors that I work with who want me to discuss the cases with them and the books with them, to literally, as you say, to talk through the plots. And that's really challenging for me because I feel quite bad if they say to me, this is how I want to write it, and I say, well, that's not how it would work in reality. That doesn't mean don't write it like that. It just means literally, I think if you've got a book that's full of procedure, it's going to be so dull. It needs to be lively and it needs to be lightened up. And I think sometimes if you just put parts of it in, and small parts sometimes, that are factually and procedurally accurate, that's enough to kind of reassure the reader that you know what you're talking about. And I think procedural book as a novel is probably quite a dull book. But if you just get those phrases and the terminology and some of the processes and procedures accurate, I think it makes a big difference. And that's the question. It's really challenging, really, because it's a challenge for the author as much as it is for me to find that middle ground where they're getting it right, but it's interesting for the reader as well. So that they're not doing anything but of course the option, and I always say this to people, two things really. You don't have to write it the way I advise it. It's a very important point. I'm just telling you how it works in reality. You've got the options to have a character that doesn't do things, doesn't conform to the norm. So you might have a bit of a rebel detective that doesn't want to go through that channel because it's quicker to go through that channel. That's perfect for a book. And you can even write in there, the officer knew he was supposed to do this. He was supposed to do A, but actually he's not going to do that. He's going to do B. And people get things wrong, of course, all the time in terms of making mistakes, sometimes genuinely. So a police officer might do something wrong, either from a misconduct point of view or just because they're a bit inexperienced. So you've always got that, as a writer writing about police procedure, you've got that fallback position where you don't have to write it as it is straight down the line. Of course you can do, but you've always got that bit of leeway to put in it how you want to do it. And I think that's why some of the authors quite just like to know how it is in reality, and then they make their decision on what bit they're going to use. And often I'll see where they've used their kind of imagination brilliantly to put something in where it covers what I've said, but actually they're doing something slightly different as well. Does that kind of answer it?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I guess it's all about sort of like finding the middle ground between sort of like staying factually accurate, but also making sure that your book is entertaining and that you're not sort of like being.
I think that the most important part is grabbing the reader's attention and getting them focused in it and involved in that story as well. And if you can do that, it's often easier if the police aren't central characters. If you've got a detective who's your main character, then it's a bit more. And I read one recently, which is a very good book, where the main character, all the way through the book and in the series, in fact, is a detective. So that's a bit more challenging because you've then got. But then this detective is a little bit of a rogue detective. He's not dishonest, but he likes to sort of just go close to the line sometimes. So he knows he's supposed to ring his boss and tell him an update about what's happening, but he thinks, I'm not going to do that because I'm going to go out and do this myself. And that's one of the things I find that people base some of their perceptions on what they see, quite understandably, on the television. Sometimes it might be American drama, it might be UK drama, but sometimes that's not exactly how it is. But can you imagine if you watched something like Midsummer Murders and Mr. Barnaby was sat behind his desk for 45 minutes answering the phone and sending emails and writing his policy log out? Because I'm not saying that's every day in a murder detective's life. It isn't. There's a lot more to it than that. But actually quite a bit of it is about, I liken it to being the conductor of an orchestra. So you are the decision maker. You make all of the key decisions, but you can't do it all yourself because there's just one of you and there's a team of people who are working with you. So you delegate to the vast majority of that work. But I can understand why all the TV dramas that involve police characters, they have to have them as front on, they have to have them interviewing suspects, chasing around after them and stuff like that, because that's part of the program. That's what makes it exciting. I guess the key to it is if you're a writer and you want to write it procedurally right, then you don't base it on what you see on the TV, because then you will have, your DCI charging around investigating the murder, which there will be, but they won't be quite as busy as they are on TV. But that's why they write it that way, because it's not to fit it in an hour or 2 hours. They've got to get the bad guys at the end of the day, and it's interesting. So I understand that.
Yeah, that is actually one thing that I was wondering about quite a lot, actually, because I'm a massive fan of Silent Witness. I don't know if you've seen that, but they've got all the forensic pathologists, and they're doing all the detective work in this show. And I was thinking, well, maybe I was just thinking that probably wasn't entirely accurate, because I was thinking, well, what are the police going to be doing? But I guess it is just because that is very much also a character-driven show, that they've got to have the the characters who are already well established doing the bulk of the detective work in order for it to be sort of good entertainment.
Yeah, I think again because like you say, the pathology department there, the lab, they work with the police as a team. It's just the way the program's set up. But you're absolutely right. There's a bit in the Crime Writers Casebook about forensic pathology, and I wrote it for that very reason, just to say to people, your forensic pathologist or any pathologist is kind of an investigator in a way. They're an investigator of facts and science, but they're not an investigator of police. So what will happen is, say, if you have a murder, sometimes the pathologist will be called by the police, and sometimes they'll go out to the crime scene where the body is, perhaps. Not always, because they're very busy people. But if there's a particular element about that murder, such as the way it's been committed or the way the scene looks, that requires specialist knowledge, then it's a chance that the detective in charge of the murder may call a pathologist out to the scene to have a look at things as they are. Now, your pathologist, that same pathologist, will be the same person who either later that day or maybe the next day, certainly within a couple of days, will be carrying out a forensic post-mortem in relation to the person who's been killed, to try and establish the cause of the death and how that's happened. So that they are an investigator of sorts, but they certainly don't go out taking statements from people, interviewing people. Literally, their role is to work with the police, but far more removed than you see. But absolutely right, silent witness, it's written that way. And I think, again, you view it with the fact that the pathologist is a hugely important person in a murder or any serious crime inquiry where a death has occurred, but they just work in slightly different way to how they're portrayed on TV sometimes.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we've got another question from a live viewer now. This is from Maria. She wants to know, what are the things that come up time and again in crime fiction that really get on your nerves?
Again, another good question. I would say that's probably one of them a little bit, in the fact that it's the ranks and the roles. The one that does me a little bit, and it shouldn't because it's not the biggest thing and it's not the most important, but I see it so regularly, is the way that the police talk to each other. Okay. So, for example, a police constable talking to a DCI, Detective Chief Inspector. Now, there are a couple of ranks, 3 ranks between the constable and the Chief Inspector, but people don't call each other by their rank. So you'll never hear, say, for example, PC Smith wants to talk to me, I'm DCI Gibbon. He won't come to me and say, excuse me, DCI Gibbon. He would say either sir, but often they use slang terms like gov, which is short for governor. Boss is a particularly popular one, and ma'am, of course, if it's a lady, potentially. So you've got the different terminology, but they don't use ranks. So likewise, if I was talking to a PC, I wouldn't call him PC Smith. I don't think I ever did that in all my service. You just don't do it. I'd probably call him, if I knew him or her, by their first name, because that's how it goes. That's how it happens. It's a personal thing. So I think it's just trying to remove those layers of, not bureaucracy, but the terminology is a bit, it's really important, because if you get it wrong, you know, if you can imagine reading several pages of somebody talking to a DCI or talking to a PC and just referring to them by rank all the time, you know, Constable Smith, PC Smith, and it doesn't happen. If you were referring to that person and you're talking to somebody else, a third party, then you might say, you know, I've had a word with PC Smith, because obviously they might not know who Joe is or Joe Smith. But when you actually have those face-to-face conversations and telephone calls, there is no rank. It's either sir, boss, gov, ma'am, or it's Sarge is another popular one. Sarge is a term for sergeants that's used very, very regular. It's shortened version of Sarge, whether it's male or female. So that's something that's a little bit, when you read it, I think that's just because I know how it was and how it still is. I pick it up more, whereas other people may not know it. So that's probably one thing. The other one I'd say maybe forensics and time scales. So you might say you've got an item that needs to be sent for DNA, and they send it off for DNA, and it comes back within 45 minutes with a result. That just, I mean, we may get there at some point, and there's huge steps being made whereby DNA will be able to be turned around in the same day. I mean, which is from the time when I was in the police. Even then, you're looking at a good few days before you get a DNA result, because it has to be sent to a laboratory, it has to be tested and analysed, then the results have to be analysed, then the results have to be sent back. So you're looking at quite a few days. So I think, again, just and people won't know this in fairness if they've never been involved in that process before. So just the realism of, if you want some kind of DNA or other proper forensic testing from a laboratory, it could take a few days potentially to get that result back. So they're probably a couple of the things that they're only really minor things, but if they're repeated over time in the same book, you know, it's just something that can be fixed so easily with a little bit of knowledge of kind of how it works, really. And I say we tried to cover some of the things in the book about how things work. Like, say, when you go to the police station, if you're arrested, how that process works, you know, and that type of thing. So maybe interviews as well. You know, when a police interview in the police station, there's one thing that, again, always makes me smile, which is if you think about this next time you watch a police drama, whatever that might be, particularly a UK-based one, you will probably, on every occasion, I would be surprised if you don't, you will see a uniformed police officer standing within that interview room back against the wall, or maybe outside the interview room. And I think that can only be for effect, so that you see that uniform and you link it with the police, particularly if the interviewers are detectives, because they won't be wearing a uniform.
Yeah.
But in all my years of interviewing people, I never had that police officer standing in the interview room or outside, because they just don't do it. There's no need for them to be there. You know, the only thing I can assume is it's just a visual thing to help the drama kind of unfold and that interview scene unfold. For security, you have a security strip around the interview room, and if there's a problem, if the subject becomes violent or becomes ill, for example, and you need urgent help, then you simply press the buzzer and it sounds in the custody area, and people come charging down to help, whatever the situation is. So the presence of that, it's normally a PC, but the presence of that uniformed officer who, if you start looking for them now, you'll probably realise you've never taken much notice of them before, but I guarantee probably most of the time they'll be there somewhere.
Like, I'm just thinking, because like I really like Line of Duty, and I'm pretty sure every interview scene that I've seen in that program does have a uniformed officer present as well.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, because that's probably one of the better ones, I think, in terms of they have got advisors. Some of their technology is very advanced, probably more than we are at the moment, in terms of, you know, the way they produce all these photographs and displays and all around. That's fantastic.
I wonder about that. Yeah,
really brilliant. But in reality, we're still really at the stage in a lot of murder cases where you've got a big whiteboard in the incident room and you're writing information on it using a marker pen. So those kind of 2D, 3D kind of things do exist, but they're few and far between, because obviously they're quite expensive and the priority is on solving the crime, whatever that might be.
Yeah. So yeah, like your casebook is just so helpful for writers, because you present all this information and things that we might not know in a really accessible way. Because I've read a few guides before where like they just got overly technical really quickly, and it's often like the questions that I had that I wanted answered were quite like surface level questions, and I found that these other guides didn't necessarily answer it in a straightforward way, because they just went straight into too much detail. Whereas I find that yours is just it's very sort of like easy to find information, because you split it up into like several different sections. And yeah, I was just saying to you before we started this video about like how fascinating I found your section about twins and DNA analysis.
Yes.
Because that is something that's like really relevant to me with my own writing at the moment. Because one of my manuscripts is a young adult thriller, and it's about twins. So yeah, as soon as I saw that like subheading in the book, I was just like reading that page straight away. And yeah, I really like how like easy it is to understand the book, and especially how you use case studies a lot to demonstrate what you just told us. And I think that sort of like really helps make the information a lot more accessible, because then like we can see it being demonstrated, and like we've got like a framework to apply it to. And obviously these are real life case studies as well.
Yeah, that was the thinking behind writing it in that way, so that you lay out the facts as interestingly as you can. And sometimes it's not that easy, because it is a bit dry when you're talking about, you know, the law, for example. There's quite a big section on the Police and Criminal Evidence Act, which is a huge piece of legislation that really did change the way the police operate in terms of interviewing, searching, that sort of thing. So to put that in a book is, without wanting it to be a law book, you know, for law, just for law students, I wanted to try and write it in such a way that I'll tell you what it says in the book, but I'll try and give you an example of putting it into practice, either personally from a police officer career point of view, or an interesting case, so that you can read the bare facts of it and then look at it and put it into context. So I'm hopeful that that's worked, and we have had some pretty good feedback about, you know, really liking the case studies. And of course, if you wanted to and there wasn't enough for you in there, you could always go online or whatever and look up that case if you wanted to find out a little bit more about it. And I did try where I could to use fairly well publicized cases where we could, so that people can, you know, they might know about a little bit about it already, but they might not know, you know, the real detail of the case. On the twins, yeah, that's really interesting, because I've had quite a few writers that I've worked with that have had twins somewhere in the book. There might be suspects, often they're suspects, sometimes they're victims of a murder or something like that. But the fascinating thing about twins, triplets, quadruplets are that their DNA is the same. There are some kind of very tiny differences, but on the surface, from an analysis point of view, the DNA is actually the same for twins, whereas your fingerprints are all different. So if you have two identical twins, if I've got an identical twin brother or sister, whatever, their fingerprints are going to be different to mine, but their DNA is going to be the same. Now, as the years move on, I mean, DNA started around about the 1980s. It was starting to be advanced, and we've moved on leaps and bounds since then. And I know, as I speak, work is ongoing to try and make it a bit easier to split the DNA of identical twins, so that you can say which one belongs to which, because that's really important, actually. Could be for a number of reasons. So that work is ongoing. But for many, many years, the police are in a situation where, if I give you an example, a burglary is committed, the house is ransacked, the police find a minute trace of something on the windowsill by the broken glass. They think it's blood, so the forensic officer will come out. They'll swab it with like a little cotton wool swab, and they do a little presumptive test, which indicates whether it's human blood or not. That tells them that it is blood, so they then take a swab of it and they package it up, and it gets sent away to a laboratory. The question they're going to be asking is, we know it's human blood, but do we know who it belongs to? You know, and obviously, again, sometimes people don't understand that there's millions and millions of DNA samples on a national database, but not everybody's sample is on the database. If you've been arrested before, you probably had your DNA taken. It will be on the database. So, for example, they identify the blood, they send it off to the laboratory, and the laboratory come back and say, we've got a match on this, but it's a double match. Now, they might not use that terminology, but what they're saying is the DNA matches two people. Now, the only way that can really happen is if there's been a mistake, a big mistake, along the chain of DNA, whereby somebody's put the wrong name on the bag and put somebody else's DNA. Very rare for that to happen, very rare, but it could, I guess. Or two people have got the same DNA. So the police then do their analysis, and sure enough, you know, we've got two brothers who are identical twins. They've both got criminal backgrounds. They've both had their DNA taken before. Therefore, their DNA is identical. The challenge for the police is, which one did it? You know, how do they kind of work that out? The way they would approach something like that, obviously, people may say, well, they didn't both do it. Well, they might have both been there at the time. Maybe you don't know that. But certainly that DNA, along with perhaps other evidence gathered, would mean that the police would obviously need to speak to both individuals. And I guess what they'd be doing there probably is hoping they can find other evidence. So, for example, if they've both got mobile phones, and the police do some analysis on the mobile phones to find out where they were at a given time when the burglary happened, and one of them was like 50 miles away or even more, and the other one was at that location or nearby where the burglary happened, then, you know, that doesn't necessarily mean the other one hasn't done it, because somebody might have took their phone with them. But if you see what I'm getting at, you build up the other evidence that corroborates that it's more likely that this particular twin did it than this twin. Sometimes the police may never get to the bottom of it. And if they've only got that DNA evidence, it can be difficult to prosecute, quite understandably, on just DNA evidence, because things can be wrong. They would have to speak to the Crown Prosecution Service and just give them the facts and say, this is what we've got. And then the CPS, as they're called, would have to make a decision as to whether there was enough evidence to charge either one of them or maybe even both of them. I have known cases before where two twins have been charged with the same offence because the police were unable to establish exactly which one committed the crime. It's not ideal, of course, because you do want to know, but if the evidence is there and the legal people have looked at it and said there's sufficient evidence to prosecute this case, then the police, tend to go with that, really. So twins are a fascinating element because it's just that bit of difference where, how can someone's DNA do the same? But if you think about their origin and where they've come from originally and how that's all worked, then you can kind of, I suppose, understand that, I suppose it does make sense that their DNA is going to be the same. But as I say, as time moves on, the scientists are working away at this and picking out the even smaller parts of the DNA where eventually they'll be able to say this DNA belongs to twin A and this one belongs to twin B.
Yeah, that's so interesting because, I know one of the reasons that I'm really drawn to writing about twins in thrillers is because the police can't give a clear answer about which of the twins did it in my book. So it's just this extra challenge that my main character, who is, well, because I write YA, my main character is always a teenager, So it means that my teenage protagonist can become the detective herself, and she's like striving to find something that the police have missed. And I just find that really interesting about like how in YA fiction in particular, you end up with sort of the police characters taking an almost like backseat in the story. Like they are there quite often, but the main detective work is often done by these teenagers. And I really like that dynamic, and I just find that so interesting because obviously it's showing like these teenagers as really strong characters who have got like the ability to solve these mysteries. But yeah, what are your thoughts on that, where you see like teenagers solving crimes that police supposedly can't in these stories?
Mixed, I suppose. It depends. I suppose you have to remove the old professional head and just look at it from a realistic point of view. And there will be times where they can't do it. And often these days, maybe it's because of resources, finances, things like that, or they just, they just haven't got enough ability to manage to do it. And they are hugely stretched these days. I mean, detectives nowadays. I remember when I became a detective many years ago. There were quite a few detectives. But a lot of them were kind of more experienced, so it was unusual to have young. Obviously, they started and come into be detective, and there was an apprenticeship. But a lot of the detectives were kind of experienced. I'm talking about the 80s and the 90s, so they'd been there for. It seemed to have been there forever. They were like kind of known as dinosaurs because they were a bit old-fashioned with their ways. Some of them, not all of them. Now there are a lot younger detectives, but there are a lot more. There's a lot less of them now because people. I don't know, for whatever reason. I mean, obviously the resources are limited anyway, but people don't. It hasn't got the same attraction anymore in reality to be a detective, which is really quite sad because it is a fantastic job, but it's also real hard work, and it's the sort of job where, unlike maybe on a shift where you potentially could finish your shift and go home on time, of course that doesn't always happen. But more often than not, if you're a detective, you're probably not going to go home on time. And if something serious happens, the expectation is that you're going to stay for as long as it takes, even if that means staying in the office overnight. I remember driving home from where I was working, which was an hour away, quite a few times after working a really long day, and then getting home and having what seemed like 2 or 3 hours shut eye, and then getting back up and showered and off again. And there were occasions where I was away for days on end, just working. So the social side of it and the sociable and the pressure on you is probably a little bit more in certain cases. So I can understand why that's a bit of a challenge. But I'm all for that. I don't think that's a problem at all. I think I've had a few. In fact, I'm reading a book at the moment where, for various reasons, the suspect, who is a suspect and has been arrested by the police, and she's been interviewed. In fact, she's been charged, waiting to go to court. She can see what's happening. I think somebody's trying to frame her for this crime. She can see what's happening. She can see the police are kind of, they've got some evidence, but they're not really doing much more, and she's frustrated by that. So she's gone off, exactly as you described, to try and solve this crime. And what she's going to do is try and get to the bottom of it and then present the evidence to the police and say, look, maybe I shouldn't have done this, but have a look at this. And obviously that will hopefully get her out of the case that she's in, which, in fact, she didn't do what she's accused of. So I have full sympathy with the way the book's been written. So yeah, I'm all for that. I think it's just about trying to find it. I mean, if you want it to be wholly realistic, then I guess the way that you would probably write it would be either that the person, for whatever reason, doesn't want to engage with the police, so they want to do it themselves because they know what they're doing and they feel they can do it, or they've been to the police and the police have said, no, we can't do that, and they're frustrated and they've decided, those sort of ways of managing it. They either don't engage with the police for whatever reason, or they've tried to engage with the police and the police aren't doing what they want them to do, so they've decided they're going to go off and kind of solve it themselves. But you do see quite a few books written in that way, and I don't have a problem with it at all, because actually what they do doesn't have to conform with police procedure, because they're not a police officer, and they might do something wrong and they might get into trouble with it at some point, maybe, but it's the end goal for them, isn't it? It's what they're trying to achieve. They're trying to solve a case and they're trying to bring some kind of resolution to a situation. So I think that's really quite good. And I would, if I read something like that, I'd be, I'd not be one of these sort of people saying, well, that would never happen, because it does happen sometimes. People do get frustrated and they do think, well, they're not doing anything, so I'm going to go and do something myself. Obviously, it depends what it is and to what extent. But if you're doing a little bit of your own Sherlock Holmes work, maybe a bit of internet research, a bit of having a look around, that sort of thing, as long as you don't overstep the mark from a legal point of view and you don't commit any criminal offences, then that might be the way that you want to deal with that situation.
Yeah, like it does give sort of like quite a lot of creative license in that respect, where you're not sort of like rigidly bound to like you must do this and this and this. This is like it does give you writer a lot of options while still like maintaining some level of accuracy for police procedure.
I think I mentioned before, didn't I? I think sometimes it's just a case of putting the odd phrase or terminology or something in that book that makes you can a little bit of knowledge is worth quite a lot, really, because if it's right, people will then make a general assumption that you know what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And often it's more about the characters and the plot and the story, and the procedure just kind of quite rightly sits to one side. So I often say to people, you don't have to put the procedure in, and you don't have to put it in right either. It really is personal choice. You can either put it in wrong and just put something in there to explain. For example, you've got a rogue detective, or they're not conforming to what they should be doing, or you just kind of go with the way you want to write it, because it would be particularly dry. But what I would say is, if you do put something in, I think it's always a good idea that it's accurate and that it's authentic, because I think it just makes a big difference to when it's written.
Yeah, so going back to your casebook, because it's a collaboration with Stephen Wade. So how did that come about, where the two of you decided to work on this book together to help cover climate?
That was quite interesting. It was back in 2015 when I was invited to a literary festival in Lincoln, and I was asked if I'd like to chair a panel of crime writers, which I did. And one of the crime writers was Stephen Wade. And of the three, he was the only one that was an historical. He's a crime historian, very, very interesting individual, and he's written many books already. And we just had a coffee afterwards and kept in touch after that. And one of our conversations one day just was basically along the lines of, there doesn't seem to be much out there in terms of police procedure, certainly not historical as such, because it's quite challenging to do historical procedure, but even information about historical crime, really, to a certain extent. Certainly contemporary, there seems to be a bit of a kind of a need there for something all in one place, something on the bookshelf that you can go to. You might want to read it from start to finish, but you're always going to nip back and forwards to it, because there might be something in there that you just need to reference or refer to. Shall we write a book? And it was like, well, I had never written a book before. I didn't have the first idea where to start. But fortunately, Stephen written many before, so he had some publishers, and so we began to write. Regular contact. Stephen dealt with all the historical going way back. Obviously, he's got a massive period to cover, so he just picked out relevant chunks that he thought were relevant to historical crime. Mine kind of started from when I joined the police, 1980s, up to modern day. And we just thought about some of the areas, like what happens when you're arrested, how does a murder investigation work in reality, what happens, who's in charge, what sort of specialists do they use, things like DNA, ranks, structures, all those sort of things. And we just put that all in one place and managed to put that book together. It was released at the end of 2017, and I have to say we're delighted with how popular it seems to have been. Not just with writers, it's very popular with writers because it's a reference book that they can refer to, but actually with crime readers as well. So the whole genre for crime, true crime or crime fiction, seem to like to, because it's got case studies in and context, and it's just kind of interesting, hopefully, for the reader as well. And it kind of sort of, it's been very popular, which we've been delighted with. So that book is sort of in circulation now. We're delighted with how it's been received. And then obviously the next question was, what do we do? Do we write another book? Did you want me to mention that, Madeline? Yeah, we talked about another book, but one of the things we struggled a little bit with was there's so much in the Crime Writers Casebook. What else can we write if we're going to write a similar book? And we did want to write a kind of similar, kind of a guide, but something that would be interesting to crime fans in general. So we came up with the idea of this particular one here. Hopefully you can see that. This
Yeah.
is called Being a Detective. And this was published in March last year, 2019. And again, it's full, absolutely full of information. But we've written it in a slightly different way. So this book is, as the title suggests, this is about the role of the detective. So again, we've written it from a historical perspective and a contemporary approach. So Stephen talks about how detectives were first formed, which was actually back in 1840. Touches a little bit on Sherlock Holmes and a few of the famous detectives back in those days. And then I pick it up and bring it right up to date. When I say up to date, there are things in that book about cybercrime. So, I mean, we are up to date. Telephone scams, things like something called keyless car crime, which is basically the new cars that you have that don't always have an ignition key. They just have a little fob. They send in a signal to the car. And sometimes criminals, if they have the right equipment, can intercept that signal, which gives them access to your car, because the car often is a push button. It doesn't have an ignition. So once they get the car unlocked, they can simply get in it and drive away. So I'm not giving tips to criminals in here. What I'm saying, there's a lot of information in here that actually would help people to avoid becoming a victim of crime as well. You know, it's things like phone calls trying to get you to reveal your bank details. But there's lots of other things in there as well. And it's actually written as an A to Z. So there's several different entries in each letter of the alphabet, all the way from A to Z. Totally different, really, from the case book, and it's been quite well received in the crime community as a kind of partner to the case book. So you know, we've had people sending us pictures of the two books on the shelf together, where you know these are my reference books that I'm going to use. Not everything is in there, but there's an awful lot of stuff that is. So that came out March last year. Being a detective, and at the moment we're both writing again, and hope to be able to make an announcement around some more probably guides that will help people to get the procedures and facts right and be of interest to people who are interested in crime.
Oh, that's so exciting. So yeah, would you ever consider writing an actual thriller yourself, or would you just stick solely to like writing these more like consultancy guides?
I think some people have asked me this before, a few people actually, because of the background, and I think I would never rule it out. It's not something that's been high priority for me, and I think that's probably because I went down the guides route first of all. But I think really the crime psychological thriller genre is so full of fabulous books, and there are so many writers out there, and some of them are serving police officers. Some of them are former police officers as well, or former forensic officers, that sort of thing. I think it would have to be something really, really original and something that's going to grab people. And I did have an idea, but then I read a book recently that someone sent me to fact check, and that idea was very, very similar to the one that I was thinking about. So all the time people are coming up with these brilliant original ideas. That doesn't mean to say I could never write it in the future, because I always think it'd be a bit different. But I just think maybe one day, but I think for sure if I did write one and it was crime fiction, it wouldn't be under my name. It would be under somebody completely anonymous, and I would keep it kind of just out of interest to see, because I wouldn't want people associating me writing a crime fiction book with all the work that I've done up to now on the consultancy and writing the guides as well. So I think in answer to your question, I'd never say never, but at the moment I think probably got enough on writing the guides and doing the consultancy work. I'd like to write one, I really would, but we'll see. I think we'll see what the future looks like from this point of view, and then we'll maybe decide from there.
Okay, yeah. So we've got another live question. It's also from Maria. So she wants to know, which authors do you think write their detective characters particularly well?
Great question again. Yeah, I don't like really naming individual names particularly, but there are probably one or two who write them. But then that sounds like it's me blowing my trumpet, because I might be the person that's advising those individuals. I'm not all the time, to be honest with you. But you've got individuals like M.W. Craven, Mike Craven, who's from Cumbria, and I think he's got background in the probation service and possibly military as well. And he has clearly got some people that he gets advice from, because and he acknowledges that in the books actually as well. His procedural is absolutely kind of spot on, but where it isn't spot on, he acknowledges that. So you'll always see in the acknowledgements, thank you to this person for your advice on this procedure. Anything that's not conforming to what really happens is my imagination. Does that make sense? It's people who say they know how it should be, but in order to make, and his central characters are, well, his main character is a detective. There's two actually. There's a detective and a crime analyst, which is quite an interesting combination. But again, his detective is a person who's had lots of issues from a personal point of view and a work point of view, has been in trouble before with authorities and the police. So he's kind of that rogue detective that I talked about earlier, who can kind of cross the line now and again, or sail very close to the line. But because the books are written in such a way, that's how the cases are sometimes solved. So I would say he's very, very good when it comes to accuracy. There are many, I could probably name many. C.L. Taylor, who I work with quite a bit. Her detectives are, I don't think they're ever a central character, but they're often there somewhere in terms of investigating a particular crime or, speaking to a suspect and that sort of thing. There are quite a few, probably too many for me to mention, but the ones that you tend to find the more accurate ones seem to be the ones where the detectives are more central to their writing. That the characters, they're either in it or they play a really important part in it. Whereas people who just have police things happening and no individual involved as a character, it's more kind of generic, and they just kind of touch on some of the issues. And some people, of course, don't write any in at all. They just kind of miss it out, and I can understand that, because if you don't want to go down that route and you don't want to include it, there are ways that you can write those books without including the police procedure. So it's quite. The only thing I'd say is if you put it in, you need to probably check that it's accurate and make sure you get it right. But of course, there are other ways. You can do research on the internet. There's lots of information. Police forces have their own websites. Everyone has their own website. They're all very good. So if you were basing it in a real area and you wanted to check what was happening in that area and how the layout of the police force was, I'm working with an author at the minute who's based in Devon. We've been talking quite a lot about the local constabulary, because this author wants to base it in Devon and Cornwall. So we've been talking about all sorts of things to do with specialist resources and how the force is set up, which are actually, in reality, that's how it does happen. So you could actually go down that route, or you could just invent a force and give it a fictitious name, and then you can write it however you like. And sometimes that's easy. You just invent a place. You might base it on a real place, but you might give it a different name and just have different things happening there. So to the person who asked the question, without going into individual names, there are some really good authors out there that do write their characters, and detectives in particular, as a real kind of theme and a central character, definitely.
Okay. So yeah, just to finish up then, do you have any specific tips for writers from your point of view as an expert on the police side of things, like things that us writers should be aware of when we're maybe when we're just like starting to plot out a new thriller? Is that the sort of stage when we should be thinking about like authenticity of what we're writing, or should we sort of like only think about that later once we've constructed our plot?
Yeah, I think you'd probably, neither approach would be wrong, but I think you'd probably be best putting something together first, which I think is why the fact checking is becoming a bit more popular from my side of things. People drop something out. What it does mean is I might send it back and say, well, actually, that's not real. That wouldn't happen. But that doesn't matter. It doesn't mean to say it doesn't end up being written like that, and that's absolutely fine. It doesn't have to change. But things like, I guess, a police station scenario, for example, it would be good to know how long a person can be kept in a police station for, because if you've got them being there for like a week, then that's likely to be realistic, unless it's a terrorism case, in which case it could be realistic. But if it's a standard crime case, then it's probably not going to be much more than 24 hours-ish. There are ways that you can have that detention time extended if certain things apply and as an authority. So you don't necessarily need to know the ins and outs of that. But if you've got your character that's in the police cell for, I don't know, a week, for example, it's not particularly realistic, and people would probably spot that wasn't realistic. So things like that, and police interviews. If you are genuinely going to write an interview scene with police officers, then if you're going to, I mean, there's two ways of doing it. If you want your central characters and they are police officers, if you want them to interview, then they can interview. But in reality, your interview days as a senior detective are few and far between, because once you reach a certain rank, it then gets delegated to constables and sergeants, mainly constables. So there will be specialist interviewers that are trained to interview people in a certain way to get the most information. That's whether it's a witness or a suspect. So if you're, like I say, if your DCI or your DI is going around doing everything and solving everything, then there's nothing wrong with that. But if you ask me, is that realistic? Then no, it isn't.
Yeah, of course. So, yeah, was there anything else that you wanted to say before we finish?
I don't think so. I think I've probably covered it really. I've just that, as I say, it's we hope that people find the books interesting if they do get to read them, and if they could give us some kind of feedback or review, that would be fantastic. And if anybody is watching that's either thinking about writing a book or actually writing one, and they do need some help, if it's the odd question, it doesn't have to be detailed or lengthy. If it is, then fine, that can be managed. But even if it's just the odd question that they want to ask, the odd writer's question, bearing in mind what I said earlier about that could develop into a few, but I don't mind that. I'd rather people, ask the question, and if I can answer it, I haven't got all the answers. One of the things I'll probably finish with is something that you might have asked me anyway about how do I keep myself up to date now that I'm no longer a police officer, and are these books going to have a shelf life? Well, to be honest with you, there will be information in both of those books that at some point in the future will probably be a little bit out of date, but a lot of the things in there won't be. I don't think they have got a shelf life because unfortunately there will always be murder investigation, and in the time that I was involved in that over many years, it did change a little bit, but the actual structure and the management of it hasn't really changed. Of course, forensics changed. Some of these areas do change. So it is very challenging for me to keep on top of it, and I have to work quite hard to make sure I get it right, because I don't want to be advising people and I'm giving them the wrong advice. That would be an awful thing to happen. So it's hard work for me to do it, but I manage it. And these books I don't think necessarily will have a shelf life, because things like the law will be amended and brought up to date. And who knows, in the future we may look at bringing out an up-to-date version as well, if we think there's so much that's changed that they need to be updated. But at the moment, I think for the next few years, I'd be quite confident that most of those books contain an awful lot of information that will hopefully interest people.
Okay, yeah. So, do you want to just finish by telling viewers where they can buy your book then?
Yes, both of the books, the Crime Writer's Casebook and Being a Detective, both together. There's an actor getting this in the middle of the camera, and I haven't quite got it. There we go. Being a Detective and the Crime Writer's Casebook, both available probably to order from most major bookshops now that they're open again. Or alternatively, you could order it online, either via Amazon or other online retailers.
Okay, great. So yeah, thank you so much for joining me for this conversation. It's been really interesting and really fascinating talking to you about all these police procedure and your perspective as a former detective on writers writing this sort of stuff into their crime fiction. So yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Just thanks again for inviting me, and hopefully anybody that's been watching and listening to it has found it interesting. Thank you.